was wondering what was the general reception of royal women of ambition among native subjects like in princely states. Have you come across any sentiments from the hoi polloi that either rejected or consolidated the British idea of Zenana teaming with conspiracy?
Of what? Zenana conspiracy.
Yeah.
On the Zenana conspiracy, yes. I mean, the British called it a conspiracy, but frankly, it was just royal women doing politics. You know, they saw it as a conspiracy because in their mind, women had no business in politics. Indian women never saw it that way. They said, if I am a king's wife, I'm not just his wife. I am not just a consort. I am somebody who has political meaning and political relevance. Going back to the Mughals, where women of the Zenana were diplomats, they were sent out to arrange political agreements. They were sent out to handle rebellions at times. They were sent out, they had their own industrial and sort of economic portfolios, trading, magnates, as what's her name, Mariam Zamani, Akbar's Rajput wife. She was a trading magnate who had one of the world's biggest ships. They had agents, bidding for Indigo, all of those things. So women saw that they had economic potential and they had political potential, and there was nothing wrong with it. So even when the British claimed that way, they would always try and counter it. They did not all of them cared for the white man's character certificates. If, it was required, they were capable even to, I suppose, take a little bit of a hit on their character and their reputation to achieve power. Chitra Dinal's mother is a prime example. Her personal life was used to sort of attack her on various grounds, but ultimately her goals were not personal. Her goals were political. That is what she wanted to do. Even when her son was separated from her and she was told that you can meet him once in a month or once in 3 months or whatever, she still managed to smuggle letters to him in a man's turban. So there are ways in which women found that they could still survive that scene and sometimes triumph and go on and claim political power as their prize. So the British tried very hard, and as I said, the existence of stereotypes should remind us that the stereotypes are trying to perhaps mask something bigger. The stereotypes are trying to perhaps mask something political and give അതിനൊരു ദുഷ്പേര് കൊടുത്താൽ പിന്നെ ആരും നോക്കത്തില്ല എന്നുള്ള ഒരു പ്രിൻസിപ്പിളാണ്. സ്ത്രീകളെല്ലാം മോശമാണ്, ജനാലയിലെ സ്ത്രീകളെല്ലാം ഇൻട്രീഗ് ചെയ്യുന്നു, പ്ലോട്ട് ചെയ്യുന്നു, ഓർ ദേ ആർ വിക്ടിംസ് ഹു നീഡ് ടു ബി റെസ്ക്യൂഡ്. ആ ഒരു പ്രിസമിനെ കൂടെ നോക്കുമ്പം യു ആർ എസെൻഷ്യലി നെഗേറ്റിംഗ് ദയർ പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ പേഴ്സണാലിറ്റി. That's why these stereotypes need to be interrogated, and students of history should do that.
There is that very interesting part in the book where you talk about Rani Lakshmi Bai's fidelity to her husband Kelama Valikoil Tambura, and you make a comment that the sexual autonomy that the women enjoyed, the access to divorce, polyandry, they came to be looked upon as a kind of a problem when you actually considered it from the Victorian standards. You seem to be endorsing that. I have a feeling that you say that it is that Victorian mindset actually became part of the Kerala conscience. So, what do you think would have been an alternative if these Victorian standards would not have been there? Do you think that women would have enjoyed more autonomy and they would be more empowered?
I don't think empowerment is the word, because even when matrilineal was at its idealized form, even if you take theoretically that it was perfect, it was never a world where women were equal. It was just that the world was less unfair. So I don't think I want to speculate on how it would have evolved. It's just that we must understand that a lot of how we look at women today, how we look at their bodies, how we look at their personalities and sexual autonomy is shaped by something that happened in the colonial period, precisely because colonialism wasn't just about carving out territory, it was also about colonizing the head, colonizing the mind. So read Ashish Nandi's essay where he says that the ultimate triumph of colonialism is that even when you fight back, you're still fighting from within the conceptual frameworks of the colonizer, because he has convinced you internally in your head that that is the superior form. So when women in Kerala are told that, oh, you're not wearing anything above the waist, you must now all start wearing blouses, it's a social dynamic that's coming from a position of a superior, in quotes, culture, and them looking at what they consider an inferior culture. When Mannatha Padmanabhan says that we must make our women chaste, that is not coming purely out of some awareness of history undefiled or untouched by Victorian influences. It is Victorian influences that is causing the idea that, oh, women, there's a certain kind of chastity and that is what women must have. There's no other form of chastity, for example. And the funniest thing is my father tells me how his grandmother, even as an old woman in the 70s, would not wear a blouse. The thing is, they did not expect her to wear a blouse, and they never looked at her body in a sexual way. But they did expect their sisters to wear a blouse. So even men who saw both, because it's so complex, you could end up applying different standards to different generations of women. But I don't think I'm endorsing any of this. It's just that as a student of history, you're not in the business of either making a moral judgment or speculating what might have happened. It's just that this is what happened, this is the argument, and that's how it is. It's not to say that polyandry was great or not. It's not to say that just because women could divorce, they all did. My great-great-grandmother was married twice. She was actually deeply in love with the first husband, but for superstitious reasons, she ended up discarding him. Then she married my actual great-great-grandfather, the biological husband of my ancestor. They had a terrible marriage for 30 years, but she never divorced him because she stayed in the terrible marriage. All I'm saying is that matrimony gave women the avenue that in the event, let's say a husband beats them, they had the option if they chose to walk out of the marriage without too much social kind of hoo-ha around it. It was not such a big deal in that sense. It doesn't mean they all did it. It doesn't mean it was perfect. It doesn't mean that women somehow lived in some very wonderful world back then. They did not. It just means that in some respects, there's something interesting about that period that we perhaps lost.
Matrilineal was not as monolithic or homogeneous as it looks, today, because towards the latter part of matrilineal, the figure of the Karnava became so powerful, because there was also the male head who had to negotiate with the British. So the so-called, empowered women within matrilineal systems and Tarawards, and the impartibility of the Tarawards again, had
a lot of colonial legal innovations. The colonial state, when they started dealing with matrilineal families, they essentially said that because of where they came from, where men transacted these decisions, they looked for the men in matrilineal families and said, we will only transact with you. So even if the eldest woman was officially the head of the family, because the colonial state would privilege the eldest male, slowly the Karnavan became this extremely important figure. Earlier, the power in the family was not, as Devika has argued, was not gendered. It was based on age. If it was the eldest woman, she was the head of the family. If it was the eldest man, he could be the head of the family, and his authority would be more or less accepted. But when it gets gendered, and that's what happens in Chitravirunal and his aunt's case, even though he's younger, he starts meddling even in her private affairs. And the British say, but yeah, he's the Karnavan, and therefore he can. And she keeps insisting that I am the aunt, I am the elder member in the family, I am the eldest, I am the head of the family. So in family matters, without my consent, he can't do anything. But the colonial system simply can't get their head around that principle.
What is the message or the vision that you have expressed or you have introduced in the book?
The first part of the question I got, which is that what is the broad argument introduced in the book? It's quite simple, which is that the princely states have been reduced to these caricatures. Even when we talk of modern Indian history, we're essentially talking of British Indian history, what was happening in British India, but that covered only 60% of the country. So my argument is that the remaining 40% of the country, which was the princely states, deserves to also be studied if we are to make fuller sense of modern Indian history. Because what was happening in 40% of the country, it's nearly half the country. It's important to study that and what was politics and what was social dynamics in the princely states if we are to understand modern India. That's the broad argument of the book. Of course, each chapter has different elements. One focuses on personality and how people could change things. One focuses on these tribal unrests and how that could upset feudal orders. One focuses on the idea of progress. We assume progress is an unqualifiedly good word. Progress means a good thing. But in the 19th century, progress was also a very politically loaded term. To call somebody unprogressive was a way of essentially saying your political autonomy deserves to be squashed and we will bring a new order which has got progress. And the other people would therefore counter and say, actually, no, we are progressive in our own way, and they would sort of try and redefine progress. So it's also about certain concepts like this which to us seem good versus bad, but it's actually more nuanced and complicated. So that was the broad thrust of the book.
You mentioned about Kallar rebellion, etc.
Which rebellion?
Kallar.
Kallar.
Yeah. So you mentioned about those rebellions. In the earlier times as well, there were a lot of rebellions, etc. So 19th century rebellions, 20th century rebellions. So what were the major differences when it comes to the 18th century, 19th century rebellions? So I have read that initially there were no such demand for ousting of Britishers, etc. Initially when these rebellions were there. But later it evolved over time. The nationalistic cause was not there initially.
when the rebellions took place. So, do you see any major differences when it comes to the later rebellions that evolved over?
You're talking about political rebellions like 1857 and so on.
Yeah, in the 19th and 20th century, so the major rebellion. So, do you see any, do you think that is it evolved over time or any major differences when it comes to this, the way it evolved over time because the nationalistic cause, etc. was not there initially, right?
It varies, right? I mean, nationalism as a principle, even in Europe, emerges only largely in the 18th century. Even in the 19th century, I forget the name of the famous statesman who, in the 1860s, I believe, said, we've created Italy, now we need to create Italians, because there was no Italian nationalism till about 150 years ago. In France, they had to actually sort of slowly take over the dialects and create a kind of uniform, homogenized French because they wanted one national identity. So even in Europe, nationalism was a relatively new phenomenon, and in India, by the late 19th century, it came. Rebellions, of course, broke out for various reasons. It could be a rebellion has happened in Vellore, supposedly orchestrated by Tipu Sultan's family, but in reality, it was about soldiers fearing that their caste identities were being diluted by the British and they were secretly being converted to Christianity. That was one kind of rebellion where communal identity and caste, etc., plays an important role. 1857 was very clearly a political rebellion, which also had economic undertones because there was economic resentment also, which is why a large number of people joined that rebellion. Later rebellions have, as happened in, let's say, Punna Pravaila, that was a communist affair. In what happened in Viduraswata, that was again in Mysore, it was related to the Congress in Mysore. I mean, different people may interpret and read nationalism into all of these things. I don't necessarily see it that way, which is that, yes, I think some later causes may be connected to nationalism, but we can't sort of categorically say that all of these in the past were nationalistic or whatever. Even, I have a little bit of a bone to pick when we say that, Velu Thambi Dalava was fighting a nationalistic fight. Yes, he was standing up to the British, but it was more complicated than a term like nationalism can convey. It was a different context, a different setting. Maybe there's something that we could interpret as nationalism, but to call it nationalism, the Artingel Rebellion, that was the first fight for freedom against the British. No, it wasn't. It was a much more local affair in those days. Again, I would recommend Sudipta Kaviraj, who talks about India's political landscape at that time and how Indians took a while to see each other as people in the same country, and it will give you a theoretical sense of that as well.
Like I read that initially their demands were like the remission of taxes for temporary remission, etc. Initially, but later it was evolving. The nationalistic cause came to be seen, etc. So that is what I was asking.
Naturally, because what happens is once nationalism comes in, till then you're not questioning. Ultimately, you're not questioning your Raja's authority. You may rebel, you may stand up to him for better justice, for better terms of engagement of taxes or whatever. Once nationalism comes in, you have new political concepts to play with, which basically tell you, hold on, the Raja is also expendable. He can also be replaced with something new. I think that's where the nationalism brings in a new set of ideas by which to. But again, nationalism also had different things coming into it. As scholars have said, the Congress party was a large tent. There were some people in it for very Hindu causes, some people in it for very socialist causes. The victory of the Congress was the capacity to take all of these together and use the nationalist vocabulary to construct one strong sword or one strong danda with which to beat the British. But underneath that, all the older forms continued. It's just that, people also know selectively how to use something. To this day, why is it that in the same state and state elections they will vote for one party, but national elections they will vote for another? People are aware that they can use different things in different combinations and different settings.
View princes in history, at least in the initial modernist history that we get to read more often. We see them in basic, if I am to generalize, in two basic strains. On one side, we see them as these traditional characters who are adamant in their thoughts and kind of dogmatic when it comes to their beliefs. And on the other side, we see them as kind of fickle creatures who just go with whatever helps them remain in power. So in such, if we were to maybe talk about this paradox a little bit more, we see that there is this feature of adaptability that we see in them. You mentioned about communal violence and how that was like comparatively lower in that era. Can you compare or rather elucidate the relationship between this adaptability, this strains of thoughts, and this features like communal violence that we see as modern problems of today?
But adaptability is essential for anybody in a political space and anybody who wields power. That's essentially the argument of the book as well, which is that the Rajas or people who wielded power in the princely states were not fossils, they were not monolithic, they were not unidimensional. In different contexts, they could behave in different ways. As I said, a set of states, earlier they would support the Congress, and 20, 50 years later, they've ended up supporting the Hindu Mahasabha because their interests and incentives have changed and they have to adapt in order to survive. Under different conditions of pressure, at a time when the East India Company's influence is still low, the Rajas have greater influence. So, somebody like Baizabai in Gwalior, when the British resident comes to her court, she sends out nobody to receive him. He in fact comes and finds that he doesn't even have firewood in his kitchen because the Rani has decided to treat him as a non-entity. Why? Because she still has an army of 40,000 soldiers. And that gives her a kind of strength. Gwalior is weaker than the East India Company, but it is not fully enfeebled. But by the 1840s, the British completely dismantled that Baroda, the Gwalior army. After that, the Gwalior Rajas have a completely different tack. Now their way of adapting and responding to the British and imperialism is slightly different, slightly more diplomatic. So, because you're in power, and if you want to cling to power, adaptability it comes with the territory. You have to be able to change with the times. And this is again my larger point, that why do we think that things that happen today couldn't happen in the past? We've seen MLAs being locked up in resorts, jumping over walls, very easily ditching one ideology for another, giving some very officious reason for it, whereas in reality it's just about staying relevant and staying active in the corridors of power. It was the same game back then as well. People may have different glosses for it and different official narratives around it, but ultimately this is what defined power and power politics everywhere.
What are the kind of pattern you see in the past which you think may happen now? Like maybe some interesting pattern which in past which you think is coming back and kind of happening now?
This is a naughty question, but well, there are patterns in the sense, look at things structurally, right? There was, when I did my Deccan book, for example, there's something called the Bahmani Sultanate. How did it collapse? There was a shelf life of sorts. There was the empire was sustained for a while. Ultimately, it was cannibalized from within. People within, the Rajas failed to maintain certain economic balances, certain communal balances between different important groups of people, and it was cannibalized from within, and there were successor states carved out from within. So their own governors ended up becoming independent rulers. What happens in Vijayanagara? Similar. You have a heyday in which the empire is the big thing. But ultimately, Vijayanagara and the rulers suffer a blow. They lose a major battle in 1565. Their legitimacy is weakened. They continue on. They sort of hop around on one leg for about 70 more years. But their own governors slowly start picking up and becoming autonomous and ultimately become the successor states of Vijayanagara, including Mysore, the Nayakas of Tanjavur, etc. Look at the Mughals. The Mughals, after Aurangzeb, the empire became too vast, unsustainable, all kinds of problems. The emperor's legitimacy remains. The emperor still has some influence. People still go to the emperor to get a certificate, to get their position certified. But in reality, actual power has left the capital for the provinces, where provincial governors are becoming strong. All these grand power structures, all these grand constructions ultimately do break down. And often not because of external shocks. The external shocks only enable further degradation from within. And you see that in older political systems, and you see that even in our world today.
So when the Rajas were funding nationalists and revolutionaries, did they not realize that they could also be removed and their legitimacy could also be questioned? Or did they realize that too late and then switch on to Hindu Mahasabha?
So it depends on who you're talking about. So for example, somebody like Sayajirao Gaikwad of Baroda, he's on the record saying that if there's ever to be an Indian nation, the princely states have to go. So some rulers were quite astute and they were aware that, okay, if we are to ultimately see an Indian nation, the Rajas and their states may even have to make their way out of history. Many others supported the Congress and the nationalists. That's why I keep saying the 1930s. That's when the falling out happens with the Congress, because before that, Congress, etc., was still elite politics. It was still elite people, largely speaking English, largely in a few urban hubs, who were developing nationalism as a kind of intellectual case. It was still about debates, it was still about newspaper articles, it was still about annual meetings of the Congress where people would give speeches. It was not a mass movement. So that the princes had no issues funding because it did not upset the broad sort of equilibrium that existed. The moment under Gandhiji it transitions to mass movements, that is when the equilibrium is being upset because mass movements threaten princely power also. That's when the princes realize, hold on, Congress is now, getting out of hand. So that's right. It depends on what period you're looking at. And as I said, certain princes knew. But it wasn't just that. Princes could also support, even late in the day, they could support certain things just to annoy their enemies. So I remember, I forget where I read it, a British resident in a fortnightly report, Lana, where in the 1940s, when the communist problem, as it was called then, was building up in Travancore, it was being encouraged from Cochin a little bit. So things you couldn't publish in Travancore, the Cochin government would look away and it would be published there and then imported into Travancore, smuggled into Travancore. So Cochin and Travancore, of course, have their historic rivalry. And this was one way the Raja thought, let me look the other way. Anyway, my neighbor is too big, let him suffer a little bit. I'll just look the other way as he suffers. Communism could have come back and taken over the Cochin Raja's state as well. But in that instance, he decided, let me just, try a small trick and see.
Like, do you think the fascination we still have with the royal families, not just in India, you see it worldwide, even in democracies, royal families are accorded as status, celebrity status, or we look up to them. Do you think it's because the nationalism was not organic, or we still want to hop on to the past? What do you think is the reason for that?
I think the past thing, which is that, in many countries it represents a kind of stability. Again, you can say this about the individual Queen Elizabeth. I don't know about the monarchy in general. But at the end of the day, for a lot of people in Britain, this one person has been on their banknotes from the 50s till 2021. That face has aged, but it has always been there. So through crises, through economic doldrums, through different governments, swings this way, that way, for some reason, this one person has sort of stood constant over there. And some people find a certain political value in that. They see that it offers some kind of stability, it offers some kind of common connection and feeling to a lot of people. But in a lot of places, royalty has now been essentially tamed. Even in Britain, where you can argue that there is this huge romance around the royal family, the Queen has to now pay a shambalam from her personal resources to her younger children. The state doesn't support them. Now with the next generation also, it's only the eldest one who's in the direct line of succession who's likely to be supported. The others already cut loose and essentially no longer gets any kind of support. So there's a kind of economizing, there's a kind of bringing it in line with the modern age and all of that. But I don't know, it's tough to say why people cling on to royalty and all of that. In some places, I think it's just happenstance. They had it was never toppled, so it continues. In some places, it was toppled, therefore it doesn't exist, and nobody seems to want to bring them back. In India also, even people who have a kind of romance around the royal families don't really want to bring them back. Even here, the staunchest royalist in Trivandrum, who still kowtows and will do his full toil in front of the Raja in Kaudayar Palace, will, I think, hesitate to suggest that the Raja should start ruling over Kerala. So it's a mix of things. People read different things into the descendants of royalty, sometimes just cultural relevance, sometimes something religious perhaps, sometimes just historical nostalgia. Each generation tends to look back at the previous one in a slightly more rose-tinted way. Sridhara Menon has this lovely line in his Triumph and Tragedy in Travancore, where he talks about this whole cult around Sri Chitrayamal was a very recent creation. As late as 1949, when he gave up power, he was respected as a Raja, but there was no cult around him as if he was a god incarnate or whatever. That really builds up much later in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, in that phase, through writing, through people building it up in the press. And now many people quite seriously believe in that kind of thing. So if that's happened in this one state alone, imagine the various forms and things that people see in royalty in different parts of the world. But there's an interesting example on this. If you read Nandini Sundar's study on Bastar, she talks about how in the British era, the people of Bastar rebelled against the Raja and he was the villain. Post-colonial India, where it was the Indian state that was now oppressing them or troubling them or whatever, there was actually a moment of consolidation around the royal descendant to try and stand up to the Indian state, because the royal descendant still represented something that could be mobilized or could be used to mobilize people. So again, the same people can behave in different ways against, with the same family.
How you are able to get these documents from princely states? That is really baffling me, because I am a person who is searching for so many documents. But when I am looking regarding this Kerala, Tamil Nadu issues, when I was in Chennai, I got everything. But in Kerala, I am hardly seeing anything from our side. When I met Sridhar Menon sir before he's died, he told me that he got the opportunity through the British archives. So my question is whether you are able to find a rich documentation from the princely states. Okay, when I talk with the lawyers of Punjab, Haryana, Odisha, and Karnataka, only one state is preserving the documents meticulously, like the presidency states is only Mysore. Rest of the states, the documentation is very pathetic. Sure.
It's true that the state of the archives in India is always a bit distressing, and you often sometimes you're drained simply by the process. You put in it takes a while to find the right catalog number. Then you put in a request and you're asked sometimes to wait for 4 hours or something. At the end of it, someone may come back and say, "Oh, this file is missing. We can't find it." And then you're like, "Why did I just spend 6 hours here trying to find a file that doesn't exist?" So some of that happens, but there's plenty of material in the Kerala State Archives. At least as far as my work has gone, I've seen some stuff in the Kerala State Archives. The Secretariat has its own records. Not all of it may be accessible, but there is material over there. The advantage with the archives in London, and people have said, "Oh, നിങ്ങളുടെ പുസ്തകം എല്ലാം ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാരുടെ റെക്കോർഡ്സ് ആണ്." ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാരുടെ റെക്കോർഡ്സ് അല്ല, ഇവിടുത്തെ റെക്കോർഡ്സ് തന്നെയാണ്. പക്ഷെ അവിടെ കൊണ്ട് വെച്ചെന്നേ ഉള്ളൂ. പഴയ ഓലഗ്രന്ഥങ്ങളും ഒക്കെ അവിടെ ഇരിപ്പുണ്ട്. It's just that it's sitting in London, therefore it's not easy to access. But a lot of the more interesting files have been maintained there, all the way going back to the 17th century. So for instance, Attingal Rani's grant of Anjadengu to the British, we don't have a Malayalam record for it, but the English version of it is available from 1684 ആണ് ഇവിടെ എല്ലാവരും പറയുന്നത്, പക്ഷേ 1694 ആണ് അതിലെ data. So there's a 10-year gap between the two documents. So you get that over there. Kerala Varma Veliyuthambra's so-called controversial confession letter when he was locked up in prison, the original Malayalam was possibly destroyed because it's embarrassing, but the English version that was sent to the British survives in the archives over there. A lot of secret files that the British made, and often the secret files carry the most interesting part of politics. All the inner workings that were taking place, all the negotiations that were taking place behind the scenes. The Indian versions, the story goes, were destroyed when the British left, because some said they didn't want Nehru and the Congress to blackmail the princes, or simply just to destroy the record of the British having done anything naughty. But the versions that were sent to the crown to the crown government or the head government in Britain, those versions are still available in London. So you do find a lot of sources, but also look a lot for private papers. I found a lot in Lord Minto's private papers, National Library of Scotland. Lord Curzon's papers are sitting in the British Library. Lord Curzon's wife's papers are sitting in a box in somebody's garage, but they also have value because what a viceroy puts on his file is not the same as what he tells his wife. He may be much more honest and much more detailed in what he writes to his wife. Therefore, that also matters. So sources like that, you have to pull together. In this book, I've got, of course, the official archives, Delhi, Kerala, all of that, the British archives, newspaper sources. There's a bit which got me into trouble with some of these Tambrian descendants about Ravi Verma's father-in-law being embroiled in the murder case. It does not exist in any of Ravi Verma's biographies as such. But the newspaper record, it was such a scandal in 1862 that was covered by the press internationally all the way to Manchester and places. And therefore the newspaper record gives you access to that, something that has otherwise been buried or forgotten. Then there's all kinds of oral history that you have to collect. There's material evidence left in buildings, and even interpreting those paintings, even looking at Ravi Verma's paintings and the elements he's introduced into the paintings, what kind of English books, what is the background, that can tell you something. So that's how I work. You just collect information from as diverse a set of sources as possible, then you can reconstruct perhaps what actually happened.
Yes.
And frankly, there's been a lot of destruction of documentation also, sometimes for very, very frivolous reasons. I have met people who said, ഒരു കബേർഡ് നിറച്ചുണ്ടായിരുന്നു, പക്ഷേ അത് തീയിട്ട് കളഞ്ഞു, ചുമ്മാ കുറേ വർഷമായിട്ട് ഇരിക്കുമായിരുന്നു, so we haven't maintained it, we destroyed it. So there's that kind of thing also that happens, and that's a real loss. It's quite a serious loss.
Within the academia, there is this grouse that Manu seems to be getting all these archives. Where are all the archives? Because we can't access them.
Look at my 150 pages of
archival access, actually.
All the sources are meticulously listed there, which is why you can, if anybody, that's why I leave such heavy notes, because I think the narrative is readable, but the thing is, if somebody wants to pry further, they want to read further, they should know where to look. So you leave detailed chunks of notes.
How much of it in the London and Scotland libraries are digitized?
A good measure is being digitized. One thing I always recommend to everybody is the Asiatic Society in Bombay. They've digitized a whole chunk of newspapers going back to the early 19th century. So you have we assume that a lot of debates on nationalism began from the 1870s, but you actually have newspaper debates being carried on with pseudonyms. someone will call himself Hindu patriot, someone will call himself Mohammedan patriot, and there'll be a white man, and they're carrying on a correspondence over weeks in newspapers, arguing out various political points. It's a newspaper record. It's fascinating to read that in the pages of, I forget which paper it was, but Times of India on the Ipa Illata papers like Bombay Gazette. I've been looking at the English ones mainly, but there's a whole wealth of others also. Kerala has old newspapers that ought to have their archives, Manorama, etc. It should be digitized because it's a wealth of information.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a scintillating evening, Manu. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you to the audience for coming. And I know it was COVID times and it's not easy to get out of the house, but thank you for showing up in such flattering numbers. Thank you.
Thank you.